Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Senator Sessions. You and I have worked together on a number of bills, including leading the International Adoption Simplification Act, which I believe made a big difference to a lot of families in keeping their siblings together when they were adopted. Senator Cornyn and I led the sex trafficking bill that passed last year, and you had some important provisions in that. And then we've worked together on law enforcement issues, and I appreciate your respect and the support that you have from that community. And I also thank you for your work on drug courts, something we both share as former prosecutors and believe in the purpose of those courts. But I wanted to lead first with another part of the Justice Department's jobs, and that's protecting civil rights and the right to vote. My state has the highest voter turnout in the last election of any state. We're pretty proud of that. And as county attorney for 8 years for Minnesota's biggest county, I played a major role in making sure that the election laws were enforced and that people who were able to vote could vote and that people who shouldn't vote didn't vote. Since the Voting Rights Act became law more than 50 years ago, we've made progress, but I've been very concerned about some of the movements by states to restrict access to voting in recent years. We haven't been able to pass the Bipartisan Voting Rights Advancement Act forward last Congress, and I just think it's an area that's going to be ripe for a lot of work going forward. You and I talked about how at one point you previously called the Voting Rights Act an intrusive piece of legislation, and I wondered if you could explain that as well as talk about how you will actively enforce the remaining pieces of the Act. That would be Section 2, which prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, and this Section 3 bail-in provision through which most states can be subject to preclearance. And you don't have to go into great detail on those two sections. You could do it later. But if you could just explain your views of the Voting Rights Act moving forward and what would happen in terms of enforcement if you were Attorney General.
The Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, was one of the most important acts to deal with racial difficulties that we face, and it changed the whole course of history, particularly in the South. There was a clear finding that there was discriminatory activities in the South, that a number of states were systematically denying individuals the right to vote. And you go back into the history, you can see it plainly. Actions and rules and procedures were adopted in a number of states with the specific purpose of blocking African Americans from voting. And it was just wrong, and the Voting Rights Act confronted that. And it, in effect, targeted certain states and required even the most minor changes in voting procedure, like moving a precinct across.
So how would you approach this going forward? For instance, the Fifth Circuit's decision that the Texas voter ID law discriminates against minority voters, that was written by a Bush appointee. Do you agree with that decision? How would you handle this moving forward?
Well, I have not studied that. There's going to be a debate about it. Courts are ruling on it now, and that is a voter ID, and whether or not that is a improper restriction on voting that adversely impacts disproportionately minority citizens. So that's a matter that's got to be decided. On the surface of it, it doesn't appear to me to be that. I have publicly said I think voter ID laws properly drafted are okay, but as Attorney General, it'll be my duty to study the facts in more depth, to analyze the law, but fundamentally that can be decided by Congress and the courts as they interpret the existing law. I did vote to extend the Voting Rights Act several years ago. I thought it included Section 5, but later Section 5 was eliminated by the Supreme Court on the basis that progress had been made. And on an intrusive question, let me answer that. It is intrusive. The Supreme Court on more than one occasion has described it legally as an intrusive act because it only focused on a certain number of states, and normally when Congress passes a law, it applies to the whole country. So it's a very unusual thing for a law to be passed that targets only a few states. But they had a factual basis. They were able to show that it was justified in this fashion. So that's the foundation for it, and that's why I supported it, its renewal.
Mm-hmm. And I think you'll understand as you look at this issue that there are many voters, people who are trying to vote, that view some of these rules that are put in place as intrusive for them because it makes it harder for them to vote. And I think that is the balance that you're going to need to strike. And I hope, coming from a state that has such high voter turnout, that has same-day registration, very good turnout in Iowa as well, right below us, states that have put in place some really expansive voter laws, and it doesn't mean Democrats always get elected. We've had Republican governors in Minnesota, we have a Republican governor in Iowa, and I just point out that I think the more we can do to encourage people to vote, the better democracy we have. And I want to turn to another quick question on a Democratic issue, as in a democracy issue, that was raised by Senator Graham and as Senator Whitehouse. I just returned with Senators McCain and Graham from a trip to Ukraine, Baltics, Georgia, and learned there about how these intrusive cyber attacks are not just unique to our country, not just unique to one party, not just unique to one election, and they've seen that movie before in those countries. And do you have any reason to doubt the accuracy of the conclusion reached by our 17 intelligence agencies that, in fact, Russia used cyber attacks to attempt to influence this last election? I'm not asking if you believe that influenced it, just if you believe the report of our intelligence agencies.
I have no reason to doubt that and have no evidence that would indicate otherwise.
Thank you. Violence Against Women Act, Senator Leahy asked some of those questions, really important to me. You and I discussed it. I just have one question there. If confirmed, will you continue to support the life-saving work being done by the Office on Violence Against Women?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Immigration, you and I have some different views on this, and I often focus on the economic benefits of immigration, the fact that we have 70 of our Fortune 500 companies headed by immigrants. At one point, 200 of our Fortune 500 companies were either formed by immigrants or kids of immigrants. Roughly 25% of all U.S. Nobel laureates were foreign-born. And just to understand, in a state like mine where we have entry-level workers in dairies are immigrants, major doctors at the Mayo Clinic, police officers who are Somali, if you see that economic benefit of immigrants in our society.
Well, immigration has been a high priority for the United States. We've been the leading country in the world in accepting immigration. I don't think American people want to end immigration. I do think that if you bring in a larger flow of labor than we have jobs for, it does impact adversely the wage prospects and the job prospects of American citizens. I think as a nation we should evaluate immigration on whether or not it serves and advances the national interest, not the corporate interest. It has to be the people's interest first, and I do think too often Congress has been complacent in supporting legislation that might make businesses happy, but it also may have had the impact of pulling wages down. Dr. Borjas at Harvard has written about that. I think he's the world's perhaps most effective and knowledgeable scholar, and he says that does happen. Wages can be diminished, and one of the big cultural problems we have today is middle-class and lower-class Americans have not, lower-class economically, are not having the wage increases that we'd like to see them have. In fact, since 2000, wages are still down from what they were in 2000.
Mm-hmm. I just see that we can do a mix of making sure that we have jobs for people here and then understanding that we're a country of immigrants.
On that subject, you're familiar with Canada.
Okay.
We are people of America. You have actively gone against prohibiting legislation that would keep white families together. You are anti-immigrant. You are supported by hate groups that have been trying to push racist legislation. You are not a good attorney general.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just have another 30 seconds here. I had one last question.
Maybe 45 seconds. Mr. Chair, I would just say that you come up close to the Canadian system. I think may be some of those policies ought to be considered by the United States.
My last question, Mr. Chairman, is on a reporter's issue. Free press, I believe, is essential to our democracy. And I've always fought to ensure that those rights aren't compromised. My dad was a reporter, a newspaper reporter for years, and I'm especially sensitive to the role of the press as a watchdog. You've raised concerns in the past about protecting journalists from revealing their sources. You did not support the Free Flow of Information Act. In 2015, the Attorney General revised the Justice Department rules for when federal prosecutors can subpoena journalists or their records, and he also committed to releasing an annual report on any subpoenas issues or charges made against journalists, and committed not to put reporters in jail for doing their job. If confirmed, will you commit to following the standards already in place at the Justice Department, and will you make that commitment not to put reporters in jail for doing their jobs?
Senator Klobuchar, I'm not sure. I have not studied that, those regulations. I would note that when I was United States Attorney, we knew, everybody knew, that you could not subpoena a witness or push them to be interviewed if they were a member of the media without approval at high levels of the Department of Justice. That was in the 1980s. And so I do believe the Department of Justice does have sensitivity to this issue. There have been a few examples of where the press and the Department of Justice haven't agreed on these issues, but for the most part, there is a broadly recognized and proper deference to the news media. But you could have a situation in which a media is really not the unbiased media we see today, and they could be a mechanism through which unlawful intelligence is obtained. There are other dangers that could happen with regard to the federal government that normally doesn't happen to the media covering murder cases in the states.
All right. Well, thank you, and I'll follow up with that in a written question when you have a chance to look at it.
If you would, I would.
Thank you. Thank you.